You know, as an FBI agent, I worked federal crimes. But there are many crimes, both local and federal, that people consider victimless, like drugs, assisted suicide, gambling, and public drunkenness. Our show today will deal with prostitution. Is prostitution a victimless crime?
Do you want a blowjob or something?
I'm good, thanks. Whisper, do you have a boyfriend?
Yeah.
Yeah. What would you do if you... What would you do if he was having sex with another girl?
There's no victim here. Nobody's upset. Nobody's saying, hey, I've been wronged by this guy. I'm upset with this guy. So what is a victimless crime? Well, a victimless crime is a crime where there's no victim. What's a victim? A victim is somebody who's been trespassed upon in some way. Somebody who's been a victim of maybe force or fraud or coercion, or somebody who's at least been put at some substantial risk of those things.
Many people lump human trafficking with prostitution, but there's no doubt in my mind that human traffickers should get the death penalty.
It isn't just a problem overseas, nor is it confined to big cities. Human trafficking happens right in our backyard. It's estimated that anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 Americans are trafficked each year. More than half are children. Distinguishing between prostitution cases and human trafficking cases, however, is often difficult for law enforcement.
You know, it's really hard to know. What I have learned is that if they do have a trafficker, they develop a bond with that person, and they don't want to give that person up, even though they're being mistreated.
Judge Ted Limpert oversees prostitution cases at Syracuse's new human trafficking court. The court is taking a new tactic in combating prostitution by treating defendants as victims first. Last fall, it's still too soon to tell if this new strategy is working, but human rights groups are applauding such efforts that no longer treat prostitution as a victimless crime.
Well, so far, it appears that prostitution has victims. But let's hear another viewpoint.
I want to talk about sex for money. I'm not like most of the people you'll have heard speaking about prostitution before. I'm not a police officer or a social worker. I'm not an academic, a journalist, or a politician. And as you'll probably have picked up from Mariam's blurb, I'm not a nun either. Most of those people would tell you that selling sex is degrading, that no one would ever choose to do it, that it's dangerous, women get abused and killed. In fact, most of those people would say there should be a law against it. And maybe that sounds reasonable to you. It sounded reasonable to me until the closing months of 2009, when I was working 2 dead-end minimum wage jobs. Every month my wages would just replenish my overdraft. I was exhausted and my life was going nowhere. Like many others before me, I decided sex for money was a better option. Now, don't get me wrong, I would have loved to win the lottery instead, but it wasn't going to happen anytime soon, and my rent needed paying. So I signed up for my first shift in a brothel. In the years that have passed, I've had a lot of time to think. I've reconsidered the ideas I once had about prostitution. I've thought about what's needed to protect other sex workers from these things. Maybe you've thought about them too. And then I'm going to tell you about what we, as sex workers, actually want. The first approach is full criminalization. Half the world, including Russia, South Africa, and most of the US, regulate sex work by criminalizing everyone involved. So that's seller, buyer, and third parties. Lawmakers in these countries apparently hope that the fear of getting arrested will deter people from selling sex. But if you're forced to choose between obeying the law and feeding yourself or your family, you're going to do the work anyway and take the risk. Criminalization is a trap. The law forces you to keep selling sex.
Like any other career, prostitution has its hierarchy. At the bottom are streetwalkers, many of whom have drug or alcohol problems. But many girls come to look at prostitution as a business, and they graduate from the streets to their apartments or hotels. But this comes with a real risk.
Hi, are you my 3 o'clock?
A couple of years ago, a friend of mine was nervous after she was attacked at work, so I said that she could see her clients from my place for a while. During that time, we had another guy turn nasty. I told the guy to leave or I'd call the police. And he looked at the two of us and he said, "You girls can't call the cops. You're working together. This place is illegal." He was right. He eventually left without getting physically violent, but the knowledge that we were breaking the law empowered that man to threaten us. He felt confident he'd get away with it.
Yeah, it seems like the legal system, especially in the U.S., creates victims by prosecuting both the prostitute and the client. And if anyone believes that men will stop miraculously give up sex, then they are deluding themselves.
Prostitution is one of the few, if not the only, sector of the labor force that's dominated by women, and always has been. And that arises from the very simple fact that, there's a lot of men who want to have a lot of sex, more than they're able to get for free.
So what are the prostitution laws like around the world, and should prostitution be legal? Well, first of all, prostitution, simply put, is sex for money. This comes under the umbrella term of sex work. However, it is legally distinct from other industries like pornography. Prostitution is generally correlated with higher rates of crime and poverty, and that's part of the reason many countries want to get rid of the practice. However, many governments have turned to legalizing prostitution as a form of harm reduction to give vulnerable sex workers more protections. Most South American countries allow prostitution, including Brazil and Argentina, and many European countries have legalized aspects of prostitution too, including Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Spain. Legalizing prostitution and adding government regulation has shown to benefit sex workers and society at large.
In a perfect world, men wouldn't go to prostitutes. But men have always been pigs, so prostitution will be around forever. So let's hear from some subject matter experts discuss the benefits of legalized prostitution.
I'm Alice Little, and I am a legal sex worker.
Hi, I'm Lexi Jade, and I'm a legal sex worker.
There's a huge conflation between forced, coerced sex trafficking and sex work. The biggest difference is choice. Those of us that choose to enter the industry do so of our own volition and freedom.
We retain ownership of our bodies, we set our own prices, we say no when we want to. We can be in the middle of a party and I can ask you to leave and you have to leave. Everything is our choice, everything goes as far as we want it.
It's not to say that there's a right way and a wrong way to do sex work, but I choose to work out of the legal brothel. Oh yes, sex workers pay a lot of money in taxes. This year I will be paying over 6 figures in taxes. I file as an LLC, much like any other business would, and then I'm able to deduct my expenses from that, of which there are quite a few.
Yeah.
We are independent contractors at the ranch. That's what allows us to have the freedom to set our own prices, offer the services that we want. We're essentially all businesses within a business. There are so many different services that are offered by legal sex workers. The service that I most get requested for is GFE, or the girlfriend experience, where we might go out for dinner or lunch, have a conversation, and it's so much more than just the sex. It's the intimacy of it. They want that active listening, the companionship, and the intimacy.
An intellectual, beautiful woman on demand.
We work with virgins. We work with straight women that have never learned how to interact with their own bodies in a pleasurable way. I have also worked with folks that are on the autism spectrum in teaching them new ways of communicating and experiencing dating in a way that's healthiest for them.
I really enjoy being a safe place for a couple to come into when you're unsure. Things can go beautifully. It literally can change someone's relationship.
Other couples come in because they want to have fun. They want to have a third person in their relationship, and certainly aren't in this to steal someone's husband.
Yeah, to be clear, like, the idea of us stealing your husbands is the same as childcare providers trying to steal your kids. That's just not happening. I definitely get satisfaction sexually from my job. That's a given. I allow myself to enjoy it. Whatever happens, happens. I usually have a great time.
It's a very rewarding job. You're getting to make these amazing, intimate connections with somebody. And so I always encourage people to lean into their fantasies and their desires and actually put their pleasure first in that equation. I like to enable them to do that.
That is so true. It is the time to be selfish and ask exactly for what you want and agree upon it and live out your fantasy.
Something that I'd really like people to know about legal sex workers, it's something that we choose to do because we're looking for that safety net of having the legalization. Unfortunately, legal sex work only exists in Nevada.
For me, a big misconception with legal sex work, we're doing something bad. We're hurting you, your families. ourselves, our children. It's nothing more than two people coming together and appreciating each other.
These subtle distinctions between trafficking and consensual prostitution presents a problem for law enforcement. Most cops could care less about a lady making a living at sex. It's actually a waste of manpower. But many cities have their obligatory vice raids every year. In fact, most prostitutes, or many prostitutes, are pro-law enforcement and provide valuable information to cops. Cops get no enjoyment about arresting some plumber getting his rocks off. They'd rather be chasing pedophiles.
If you try to prohibit something that people want or need to do, whether that's drinking alcohol or crossing borders or getting an abortion or selling sex, you create more problems than you solve. Prohibition barely makes a difference to the amount of people actually doing those things, but it makes a huge difference as to whether or not they're safe when they do them. As a feminist, I know that the sex industry is a site of deeply entrenched social inequality. It's a fact that most buyers of sex are men with money, and most sellers are women without. You can agree with all that, I do, and still think prohibition is a terrible policy. In a better, more equal world, maybe there would be far fewer people selling sex to survive. But you can't simply legislate a better world into existence. If someone needs to sell sex because they're poor, or because they're homeless, or because they're undocumented and they can't find legal work, taking away that option doesn't make them any less poor, or house them, or change their immigration status. People worry that selling sex is degrading. Ask yourself, is it more degrading than going hungry? Or seeing your children go hungry? There's no call to ban rich people from hiring nannies or getting manicures, even though most of the people doing that labor are poor migrant women. It's the fact of poor migrant women selling sex specifically that has some feminists uncomfortable. People get really hung up on the question, well, would you want your daughter doing it? That's the wrong question. Instead, imagine she is doing it. How safe is she at work tonight?
I'm not sure if any of you have changed your mind about prostitution. But let me leave you with one last reason why anyone would choose to be a prostitute. How about boredom and the need for excitement?
Today, the law of the land and the law of supply and demand have split the oldest profession into two very different markets. At the bottom, poor, uneducated drug addicts work the streets for around $27 an hour. But at the top, women like Allie do the same job for a much different clientele. After we agreed to mask her identity, Allie described how she chose this job 10 years ago. Not out of desperation, she says, but for adventure. Her husband, suburban home, and good job all seemed boring at the time, so she gave them up to sell her body to strangers.
It just became really hard to sit at a computer and program for 40, 50, 60 hours a week for the exact same amount of money I would get going to the Four Seasons for 3 hours and having a bottle of champagne and, you know, in the company of a gentleman.
In your dating life, this is something you would have done?
I would have done anyway. I already was doing, yeah.
Yeah.
Probably the same people.
If you watch my show, I promise you some surprises. I'll expose some scammers on the air and out some corrupt public officials. Take a look at the John Ligato Show. Subscribe. Semper Fidelis.